Hello, this is Will Faerber from Art to Ride, and today we're looking at the first submission by Jenny of the horse Anna. Anna's a 10-year-old warm blood cross. Now she says she was a little sore in April and had some time off. Sounds like she was footsore. And she's got her back going again and just beginning, and this is her first submission. So let's take a look. Now looking at the horse a little bit, not too bad a position of the back there. Not much top line development. You see this horse is a little straight up and down the ankles there, which can affect things as we go along, but just something to be aware of. A little straight behind there, as we can see also in those fetlock joints. But nothing terrible, just pointing that out a little bit. So getting started here, you're already well on your way to doing a good job. Now, she said when she started this horse, it really didn't, it had this problem. It didn't want to move and didn't want to go forward. Now, remember when we say forward, it means to engage forward under the body. Just to point that out. But you're already well on your way. What I'm seeing here is quite good. She's getting into a pretty good, now you can see here with her head up in the air, you can see how the hind end kind of falls out behind a little bit. Well, watch as she goes into the stretch. She immediately starts to track up and swing more actively behind. So as you go here, this just gets better and better, which tells me you're on the right track. Good stretch here with good activity. And look at the difference in how the horse is stepping here. When she gets into that stretch, now we can clearly, she's well over tracking her the front feet there quite nicely now. We don't have that look like she was, the hind end is falling out behind as we saw in those first few steps. Now what I would suggest you do is every time she does hollow here, bring the head up a little too high, what you'd want to do there is do a little bit more sideward step. So whenever the horse hollows, we want to re-engage that inside hind leg to get her to push the back up and back into the stretch. But you're doing a good job of that. She doesn't stay hollow for long there, and you get her right back into a good stretch. Good activity in the walk right there. Really good there. Now we can see the horse is really starting to stride out. Really stretching that neck forward. Look how much she's over tracking now. So I'd call that right there a pretty optimal walk for this horse right now. So it's really quite good. Now you can see there she starts to slow up just a little bit. Now it's hard for me to see here your left hand, but your right hand with the whip in it rather. But take a look online and see how I hold the whip, which might help you a little bit. I do keep palms up on both hands when I'm doing this. But take a look on Facebook. They've been talking about that recently, and you can see some close-up pictures of my hands and how I hold the whip. The way I hold the whip is a little awkward in the beginning, but once you get it, it leads to a much better technique that allows you to use the whip more actively when you need it, where you need it. Remember, we always want to touch the horse basically with the whip where our leg would go, and that's what we're doing here, is teaching the horse the correct response to the whip. So for instance, when we are working young horses, we teach them everything that they need to know to be able to respond to a rider before we get up and just start going, so to speak, as so many people do. If we explain this all to the horse before we put the weight of a rider on top of it, it's obviously much easier for the horse, and we don't spend so much time, so to speak, riding in the danger zone ourselves on horses that aren't trained. So it's much easier if we train them before we get on them. They already know how to respond, they're already relaxed and have confidence in us and trust us. Therefore, they will less want to buck us off. I mean, look at it that way. So, if you just take your time, there's no reason to get hurt with horses. And what a lot of people don't realize is that, horses go, it can all seem very, very good. They can bring a young horse along. I see people make this mistake all the time. And then the horse is doing pretty well in the ring, for instance. So they decide to, let's take the horse out on a trail ride. And then, of course, the first time something comes out of the bushes at them, they find that the horse isn't really trained and it all kind of falls apart. It always takes about 2 years to put the foundation on a horse to bring the horse to the point where it's pretty reliable in most situations for us, and we can feel safe introducing it to new things without the danger of getting bucked off or run away with or something like that. Because it takes quite a while, even for very calm horses, to get to that point where really like nothing bothers them and nothing overrides the training, so to speak. In other words, they don't try to bust out of the age just because they get a little frightened by something for a split second. Now that was good how you're correcting this right here. You can see when she first started out, she wanted to crank her head much more to the inside than we would like her to do. But you straightened that right out and got the neck back straightened out where it belongs. Remember, we never want the neck to be out of line with the rest of the spine. So it's all the same thing. So the neck must continue the same arc to the inside or to the outside, as the case may be, but never more bend in the neck than in the middle of the back. So that means we don't really ever bend the neck very far. You will see people occasionally twisting horses' necks from back to side, and they'll tell you they're suppling the horse. That really doesn't supple the horse at all. It just makes the horse kind of rubbernecked. So here, starting out again, we can see how when her head is up in the air there, how the hind leg was not coming through, was not stepping up and reaching up. And as soon as you start to get that little more stretch into the horse like that, we see it already. She starts to stretch down. The walk becomes more active and regular and rhythmic. Always remember, as the rhythm is telling us everything as we're going. So if we are working a horse and we lose the rhythm, what that should tell us is that we're losing the gymnastic quality of the exercise, which means it's not doing anything for the horse in terms of building it for the future. But here we get back into a good stretch, starting to be more active. Not quite as good as it was on the other side yet, but it's getting there. Really good active walk here. How the hocks are just picking up regularly. They don't so much have that look like they're stuck on fly paper, so to speak, that we often see. Watch how every time the head comes up, we see how the hind end is lost out behind. So when we're working horse, we always want to be looking at the whole horse, not just the neck or not just the face or not even just the hind legs. We want to look at the whole horse and see how it's moving. Like right there is really good. Notice when she gets into that really deep stretch. Now, in the world today, a lot of people would tell you that this is too deep a stretch. But remember, there is no such thing as stretching a horse too deep. People who say that are people who've never actually schooled horses in a stretch. But, they've listened to somebody else who said, oh, you should never do this or you should never do that, and because it's not what they do. But in most cases, they have never trained hundreds of horses to get anywhere. So once you get the right feel for this, and we follow our own instincts once we have that sense of what we need, that is the horse working over its back and swinging deeply under its body. But horses that don't have a lot of top line will always stretch way down deep with their neck like this, because once we get them to let go of the underside of their neck, they really don't have a lot of top line. So we see this horse in silhouette here. We can see that the back is a bit dropped, and we can see how there would have been that, what the old time saying, hunter bump, so to speak, on top of her hips there. You can see that had been starting a little bit with this horse. But that was really good walk work. I really don't have anything to say about that other than the fact that you might want to look at how I hold my hands there and hold your palms up, which will make it easier for you to begin to manipulate the whip once you get a little better technique with it. But that was all very good work. And once again, you can't do too much of that work. So feel free, you could do an hour of that walk like that with a young horse or a horse that you're reschooling. No problem at all. So we can do a lot of work in the walk. It's very low impact. Mr. Oliveira used to always say this is where we explain everything to the horses in the walk. So we get them working correctly, because the faster we go, remember the one thing that a lot of people don't understand is that when they will say that their horse is going forward, but really what the horse is doing is running. Remember that the word forward means to engage forward under the body. And every horse has a point once we get out of the walk into the trot, that if we go past a certain speed, the inertia, the mass of the horse will drive it onto his forehand. So going as fast as we can is never the option. We're looking for the optimal stride all the time, which is the deepest step in the slowest rhythm. Starting out here in the walk, though, on the lunge line, this is all really good. Now, she says that she's never used side reins or shambo or any of those sort of things, and those are things that are really not necessary. Now, I do think it's usual, I like to introduce side reins at some point with horses so they begin to stretch into something rather than just stretching down without any contact with the rein. So it's always a good idea at some point to begin to use long side reins and get them stretching into it. And taking that the next step further, when we start to bring the horse up, the side reins are very useful when we change the position of them. If you haven't thought about this, by all means look at some of my videos on bringing horses up into the working frame. Instead of putting the side reins on the side, we put them up on top, off of the D-rings of the saddle usually, or the top rings off of a surcingle, so that they actually are in the same angle that your hands would be, so to speak. And when horses are ready to come up, they will come up like that into that contact and just bring their frame up without dropping their back. That's when you know they're ready to come up. They do it by themselves, just like when they're ready to collect. All you have to do is restrain with your back a little bit and the horse will begin to collect when they are strong enough to do so. Getting a little slow here in the walk, not quite the good swing. So remember what it looked like when you were walking the horse. That's the same kind of walk that we'd like to get here on the lunge line. And of course, the importance of doing the work in hand before you get on the back of the horse is that once again, we can really get it working underneath itself before we put it on the lunge. So with all older horses, I would always work them in hand before I lunge them. With babies who've never even had a bit in their mouth, this sort of thing, I would lunge them first. Almost all babies, when we lunge them, will start to stretch within a few minutes if we're not driving and letting them run too fast on the lunge line. So always remember, it's not a matter of tiring them out, it's teaching them to use their body in the best possible way. Unfortunately, today, most people use lunging as a way of wearing a horse out so they can get on them. And yes, there's certainly a certain amount of element of letting them settle, but not worn out. That's a better walk there. It starts to swing a little better. And of course, that's that issue also. If you're working with hot horses, the more you lunge them, the hotter they become. If you're lunging just to wear them out, it takes longer and longer every day. So if you're lunging correctly, it should take about 20 minutes to lunge a horse. About 10 minutes on a side is about right. Now, of course, in the beginning, sometimes that might be a little bit longer. But once you have really schooled the horse in the lunge and it really understands what we want, about 10 minutes on a side would be about right. Now, unfortunately, in today's world, many veterinarians tell people that lunging will make your horse unsound because what they're used to seeing is bad lunging, where people put horses on a lunge line and lunge them for hours at a time. That, of course, will destroy your horse's legs. And especially if you don't start in the walk and build it up slowly and you do too much cantering. Always remembering that we never want to canter a horse that can't get over its back in the canter. That's the best way to wear out your horse's back and its front legs. Good walk here, though. This is really quite rhythmic, and be on a lunge line, that's really quite good. Most of the time, you see a little slack in the rein right there, but most of the time this horse is staying out away from you very well, like he is doing there. And of course, if he doesn't, that's when we just run the little end of our lash out and give him a little tap. And if your work in hand has been correct as yours has been going so well, you'll find the horse will respond to that and move out away from you on the lunge line. We always want the horse to take up the slack in the rein, or in the line, lunge line rather here. And of course, just like the work in hand, we can do a lot of walk work. So when we lunge horses, we like to think of, especially in the beginning here, that just like it is with the work in hand in the beginning, that we're doing more work in the walk than we're doing in the trot, and we're doing a lot less even in the canter, if we're even cantering the horse at all. So always remember, once a horse is doing good in the walk and the trot, if you try the canter, and the canter is just either a mad runaway, or it's the head is straight in the air and this sort of thing, or the horse cross canters, or constantly canters on the wrong lead, things like this, those are all signs that the horse is simply not strong enough to canter. And we build more strength in the walk and trot, and one day you'll ask the horse to canter, and we'll just have a beautiful canter. And that's when you know you're ready to start cantering. The canter is such high impact on the horse. That's why it's so dangerous to do too much work with the horse not over its back, because the faster we go, of course, we increase the pressure on the horse's feet and, of course, in its joints. And, of course, if the horse isn't over its back, it has no shock absorbers. In other words, like a person running, a horse should be like that, where it lowers the joints a little bit so it absorbs that shock of movement into the soft tissue, like a person running with their knees bent and their hips lowered a little bit. That's exactly what we want the horse to do. If it does all these things very straight-legged, it will just destroy the hocks and destroy the front feet and legs and ankles and all the above. That's where all that ring bone and all of those things start. In other words, too much concussion on the front legs. So a little slow here in the trot starting out, but that's starting to look really good already. Once you just ask for a little more energy there, the horse starts to swing under. So I really think you've done a good job with this horse. He's really well on the way to doing something very nicely. That's starting to be really good there. So if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend you watch my videos on lunging, and especially where I'm using the side reins, and show you how to use them correctly. Because it would be at some point something that you do want to do to teach the horse to stretch into that contact with the bridle. Sometimes when we only lunge like this without any side reins on, we can sometimes find that, once we take contact, the horse doesn't really understand what it is that we want to do because it hasn't really had anything contacting the bit in its mouth. So it's always a good idea to do some work in side reins. Now at home, I generally lunge my horses without them, unless they come out, they've had a few days off and they're a little more fractious than usual or whatever. Then I may put them in side reins just to get them a little more consistent for a minute. Because the side reins help you sort of discipline the horse a little bit, if you will, and that when the horse starts throwing itself around with its head and neck, there's something contacting the bit that says no, so to speak. But we let them find out that for themselves. That's why we never shorten the side reins. The side reins are always long enough that the horse can stretch down into them in the beginning. And of course, really always, even when we bring the side reins up on the top, we're never shortening them and trying to pull the horse's neck over with them. They should just come into contact when we first use them, just that the horse puts its head all the way up. So it would contact the side reins if it tried to go completely upside down, so to speak. But as good as this horse is going, I would imagine when you do introduce them, it's not going to be a big problem for him. So again, coming back to a good walk here. Of course, the beauty of this walk work is that it's hard to do too much of it. If we keep our work to the sort of time that we want to, about 45 minutes is about the right amount of time for a horse to work every day. 45 minutes to an hour, never over an hour unless you're working endurance horses. And of course, most of that work is done in the walk. So once again, if you're going out riding cross country, most of that work is going to be done in the walk. You do a little trot out there, a little canter maybe, but the point is most of it's done in the walk. As I like to think, and talk about people who rode horses across the country, in the beginning of America, so to speak, or even wherever, from city to city. Someone never went out and just cantered a horse 20 miles. It doesn't work that way. So, as I said, people going out to the frontier mostly walked out there on their way, because you can sustain a walk on a horse for a really long time, but the trot is much more limited. And of course, the canter is even more limited than that, the amount that you can do without tearing up the horse. So changing directions here, we see it doesn't get quite into right away the stretch that you had on the other side. It's always a little more difficult on one side than the other until the horse really lifts its back consistently. Remember that that's what makes a horse straight, is by lifting the back. Then the horse can put the front end straight in front of the back end, which is really the only way you can do it. We see many people talking about this, and I see many of the people who talk about it don't understand this basic idea that it's lifting the back that straightens the horse. So until we do that, most horses are bent a little bit to one side. It's only when we get the back to lift that we're able to free the vertebra in a way that allow them to bend laterally from side to side, that is. So starting to get into a better walk here. You can see it wants to crowd you a little bit in this direction. And when it does, you're doing just the right thing. Just send it back out there a little bit more. and try to make that walk a little more active. Same thing here. We just want to keep sending her away from you, using your whip, and try to just run it out and touch the horse sometimes. I tell everyone this: if you want to learn how to lunge, take your whip in your backyard someplace and put a target on a tree or something. I like to do this away from horses, so you're not in a barn somewhere driving a horse crazy by snapping against a wall or something. And really practice with it, because the skill of lunging is the skill of being able to use the whip, being able to touch the horse where you need to, when you need to. Just as it is when we ride, of course. But this is starting to look a little better now in this direction. The stretch is getting more consistent. Good stretch there. And always watching to see how everything changes as the horse stretches down. Watch the back end of the horse and see if it isn't coming through. If it isn't coming through and overreaching a little more as the horse stretches down, then you'd want to ask for a little more activity, because it certainly should. Like that. But sometimes horses will stretch and they go, oh, I don't want to move even though I'm going to stretch. So we still have to keep encouraging that active movement. Because remember, just having the horse stretch into it with the front, with its neck, so to speak, and down doesn't necessarily mean the horse is coming through behind. It facilitates that happen. And if we've done our work correctly, and we've started from behind, for instance, in our work in hand, it's really the lifting of the back that gets the neck to go out and forward. That's why we don't really need to use neck stretchers and some of the devices that we see people inventing these days to try to help that. Once we understand that it's the repositioning of the spine through the impulsion or the thrust of the inside hind leg when we first begin this on a circle, that's what shoulder in was for, was to help us be able to get control of the position of the horse's back. Not just so we can go sideways, so to speak. So the same thing here, we can see the horse kind of struggling a little bit to get in the right frame, but when it gets right there, notice how everything locks in. As soon as the horse finds that position that allows it to trot correctly, it gets there and it just kind of stays there without you having to do too much. So everything you've done here has been very good. I'd like to see a little bigger trot. See right there, it's still just a little bit slower than we'd like it to be. In other words, looking for that optimal stride. Once again, the optimal stride is the deepest step in the slowest rhythm that we can keep consistently. Now that's starting to look much better. Now right there, we're starting to get enough push over the back, and that's really good. So what you'll see as horses develop out of the stretch is that their head and necks will naturally start to raise out their own and come up a little bit. As the horse develops strength, the neck will be carried up and out. But that takes a while. Remember, it always takes about 2 years to put the top line on a horse, to bring it to the point of sufficient strength to begin to develop some kind of collection, or the beginnings of collection. And that's what it takes with the best riders in the world, being very consistent about what they were doing, as you are doing here. And if you do that day after day, you'll really begin to notice these little changes. And of course, that's what makes this so interesting. I love to look at my horses, and I love to try to analyze them. I look over every little bit of them every day, notice every little change in them. Is the back still coming up? Is it starting to drop? These kinds of things. Are we seeing that top line development over the entire length of the top line? But this is starting to look really good here. Good trot right there. We can even see how, notice when the horse really gets into it and keeps that head down there and stays there consistently, we're actually starting to see a little bounce. By the bounce, I mean that the hind leg is starting to thrust up into the back and lift the front end out of the way. That's what gives us that little feeling of cadence that people used to call it, which would be the added accentuation of rhythm. When the rhythm is so perfect. And remember, when we're talking about rhythm, we're always talking about the two ends of the horse being in rhythm together. We're not talking about the speed. A horse can go at a consistent speed and be completely out of rhythm with itself. That is, the front and back legs moving independently rather than swinging together. So this has been really good work. I liked everything I saw here. I think you've done a wonderful job with this horse in the short time you've been doing it, and the horse looks like it's really developing beautifully. So I look forward to seeing you ride this horse in the near future. Do take a look at my videos about the lunging and think about beginning to use some long side reins a few times just to be sure the horse will stretch down into the contact with the rein. As I said, sometimes we hook side reins and it's just, if horses have never had anything contact with their mouth, other than just carrying a bit, they may find that a little difficult in the very beginning. But they have to get used to that idea, and it's much better that they get used to it on the lunge line than once you get up on top. So I personally, wouldn't get on a young horse that I hadn't already worked in the side reins and got to stretch into the contact. So I had a good feel for what I'm going to do when it has to take contact with my hand. So great work here today. I really look forward to seeing this horse in the future. You've done a wonderful job with it. As I said, especially in the short time. She said this horse was unsound back in April, so she's come a long way. I didn't see any resistance to the movement here at all. Looks like you've taken care of whatever that problem was. So great job. Look forward to seeing you next time. This is Will Faerber from Art to Ride.